Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Welcome back, Dan.
And welcome to February. Not quite. We're right there.
So close. I don't know what happened to the January. It just flew by.
It did. And not a whole lot of snow again. Just a lot of
mush.
Just a lot of wetness. But yeah, now we're in February, so it's a whole new ball game.
Yeah, I feel like we're in the Pacific Northwest here with the amount of rain we've been getting.
It's just, the months I go to 31 just seem to be a little extra.
Is that what it is? A month that go to 31?
It's like a transitory day, The 31st is both January and February because February only has 28. So if you want to split it 50-50, we might as well call the 30th February.
Oh, goodness gracious. But there's, 4 months that have 31 days?
I don't know. All I know is I think we're deviating from the research-based information aspect.
But according to the WVU Extension Garden Calendar, January is when you should be looking over your soil test, and hopefully you got one done. If not, go ahead and get out there since it's not frozen and get your soil test collected and then send it in so you can get your results back before gardening season.
That's right. And it's still good time to get out there and put lime down if you need lime. And we were inspired today because of that little soil test recommendation or the fertilizer ordering recommendation to kind of go over some things about the nutrients. We haven't done fertilizers in a long time, and we thought it would be a good fit right now. Get you to think, if the prices are down a little bit, maybe you can purchase that if you have a place to store it. But it's always good to plan, and we always talk about planning. So today we're looking off the other OSU extension, Oregon State University, and they have a publication. I don't see an author in there for some reason, but it is from Oregon State. It's called the ABCs of NPK. Kind of a fun little guide to kind of go through. I figured we'd walk through it, talk about it, just kind of get back to the basics, right, Karen?
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes it's good to just take a step back and just take a review of the basics. I know I get to do that at least once or twice a week for high school algebra. You go back and look over the basics. You're like, oh, yeah, that's how you do that. So we're going to do that with fertilizer today. And we'll talk about, what does NPK stand for and what those numbers are on your bags of fertilizer and what's a good fertilizer and what's a bad fertilizer. Well, not really what's a bad fertilizer, but how to apply fertilizer badly, I guess would be a better way to say that.
Well, the best times to apply fertilizer.
Well, I'm more thinking of quantity, right? So by just applying a generic let's say 19 fertilizer every year, that's not really the best way to feed your plants.
Right. And when we say fertilizers, it's several things that we kind of clump into one category, and they behave differently. So it's good to understand what you need and apply it properly. I guess I think in terms of environmental concerns and water quality, obviously, there is a negative impact if improperly applied, but you should also treat them differently, even though a lot of times we find them packaged together.
Yes. And most of the time when Dan and I are talking fertilizer here on the show, we're talking about the macronutrients. So your nitrogen, your phosphorus, and your potassium, or your N, your P, and your K. And there are additional nutrients and fertilizers out there. You have a lot of micronutrients that plants need. But generally, at least in our soils here in the Appalachians, we have most of those micronutrients fairly well available. There are some that you can add, especially if you have a certain crop that you're witnessing a problem with. If you've done a tissue test in your orchard and noticed you're low on boron, let's say, that can affect the pit development in some of your fruits and things like that. But for the most part, if you can apply the proper amounts of N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, then that will give your plants the basic nutrients they need to be strong enough to search their roots out in the soil to find the other things available. And of course, always applying organic matter to soil is helpful in getting some of those micronutrients more available.
Yeah. And when people ask me about micronutrients, the question always goes, have you taken care of the macronutrients, your N, P, and K? Because those are kind of the bigger problems, and they're easier to manage too. Because it's kind of hard to really pinpoint how much of a micronutrient deficiency you have. Like Karen was saying, tissue tests, just being specific about crops. They kind of know there's a lot of history and science that has to go into that. And they're expensive. And if handled improperly, a micronutrient can really mess up the balance of your soil, more so than the macro.
Yeah, because there is nutrient toxicity.
Yeah. And you can get into that toxicity level a lot easier with micronutrients than with macronutrients. So let's kind of get in here and talk about the big problems that we typically see in gardens and farms. And like Karen was saying, first thing you got to do is you got to do a soil test, figure out what the problem is. And, we usually start by adjusting the chemistry, because chemistry is how these things are moved into the plant, how they become available. And if you don't adjust that, you basically don't have the doors open all the way to let these nutrients in. So,
All right, so what do you mean by chemistry here, Dan?
first thing you got to do is open up the doors, and you have to adjust the pH.
There you go.
So I was getting there. I mean, I thought it was a good metaphor, So you got to open up the doors, make sure that the pH is correct. And typically, if you want to do a catch-all pH, it's 6.5 for most things. And then, you get to the specifics as you go. But if you're within 6 and 7, you're fairly good. And the nutrients that are there, no matter how much is there, whether it's a little bit or a lot of it, they become a lot more available because you got the doors open and they're able to exchange the salts and the organic forms of the nutrients that are there and made possible by that pH or chemistry. So let's kind of jump into the big nitrogen here, and the first letter of the fertilizer alphabet, the N.
The N, and it's also the first number on the bag.
It is the first number, right? Sources of nitrogen, according to Oregon, which we also have in Ohio and West Virginia, are fish, crab meal, cottonseed meal, feather meal, soybean meal, blood meal. So you get into a lot of these organic products as well when we talk about this. But your chemical-based fertilizers here, ammonium and urea, and also manures have a certain amount of nitrogen, even though maybe not as much as the other ones. And we can talk about that in a minute. But whether it's an organic form of nitrogen or a chemical source of nitrogen, the nitrogen is going to be doing the same thing for the plant. And nitrogen is one of those things that readily moves around a lot. It gets leached out. So leaching is just the act of water binding onto the nitrogen and moving it off site. And it's something that the plant always needs, because nitrogen is what helps the plant hold chlorophyll, which makes it green and makes it photosynthesize. So that's why one of the reasons you see things greening up after you apply nitrogen is because it has the capacity for more chlorophyll production. So typically with nitrogen, that's one of those things that you have to apply a little bit spread out throughout the season, a little bit in the spring, a little bit more in the summer to kind of get through the summer slump. And I like to average out the spring and summer amounts and just say kind of a balance in the fall to kind of promote that root growth and get the plant nice and hardy and ready for winterizing itself. So So nitrogen, and you don't want to put too much all at once, especially chemical fertilizer, because what can happen is, we did talk about salts before and how they affect plant physiology. And a lot of times when you're handling these things, you're handling granules, and these granules are typically in the form of salts. So they do have, they're not necessarily sodium, but they can act to an extent like salts, and they can desiccate the plant if you apply too much at one time. So usually the recommendation is 50 pounds to an acre is a pretty conservative way to make sure that you don't burn stuff up. And for the home gardeners out there, an acre is a big number, and it doesn't make sense. But this is where this is where all the algebra comes in, right?
And this is also where your soil tests can come in. I know for West Virginia's soil tests, we actually provide recommendations on depending on the crop that you're growing, whether it be turf, trees, or vegetables. And we give estimates as to what that specific crop is going to need throughout the year and how much to apply. And so if you don't want to do all the algebra, then you can get your soil. Hopefully, you got a good soil test that provides recommendations.
Yeah, and you can figure it out. 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. So if your yard's 100 by 100, you do 100 times 100 divided by 43,560, and you multiply that number by the acre recommendation, and it should give you the equivalent. That probably didn't come out exactly clear, but on paper it makes a lot of sense.
Oh yeah, and if you're applying chemicals on an acre basis, you're typically getting something that is going to be spreadable through mechanical means on a large scale. Where you're looking at, if you're a home gardener, you're probably mixing it in a watering can or sprinkling it on with a hand application device. So there are differences in what you're buying, and make sure that you're looking at the package and read the package, learn how they're expecting it to be applied, more than just that number, but look at the method of application. Do you need to dissolve it? Do you need to side dress it? How are you supposed to be applying this particular chemical? And I do want to go back to something that Dan was talking about just a minute ago, and that is the salts, because he mentioned the chemical in the formulation and they have those salt crystals. But I do want to make sure that our listeners understand that manure has a high salt content. So just because you're using an organic nitrogen resource doesn't mean you're not adding salts. In fact, you're probably adding more salts than you would if you were using a chemical application. And we run into a lot of problems, especially with our organic growers in high tunnels that are using those manure applications, because those salts build up so quickly in that type of a growing condition because you don't have the rainfall to dissolve the salts and wash them away.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the other day we were at an in-service, at Ohio State, and we were looking at manure analyses. And I noticed that the sodium levels were just about as high as the NPK that we're talking about here in terms of concentration.
The sodium levels are super high, yeah.
And I was like, I questioned it, and I said, aren't those concerning? And I guess, we were talking about row crops outdoors, right? So like Karen was saying about the rain washing it away. So I guess no scenarios are not, but they shouldn't be ignored in certain situations like the high tunnels, where you basically put an umbrella over the area so it never gets washed off.
Exactly.
Leached.
Right.
Yeah. So let's go into so nitrogen a little bit at a time. If you want to be thorough, I say once per season. A little bit in the spring, a little bit more in the summer, and then kind of a mixture, like a half and half dilution in the fall.
So that's 3 times a season, Dan, not once.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, 3 times. That's what I meant to say. In my head, I said 3. So there are other things. Let's talk about the P here, phosphorus. Phosphorus helps the plant's overall reproductive system. It's a flowering and fruiting capability and its tissue strength. So one of the things you'll notice that when you get rose fertilizer is that it has high phosphorus relative to your N and your K. And that's kind of to promote flowering a little bit more. It does kind of have that physiological effect on plants that we use for decorative purposes, horticulture. There we go. There's the word I was looking for. Phosphorus, unlike nitrogen, has low mobility, which means it can accumulate.
Yes.
Your phosphorus and your potassium, I like to say, are, as you put them down, you're putting them in a savings account because they don't move very much. They accumulate. So if every time you're putting nitrogen down, you're putting down phosphorus, what's happening is the nitrogen is getting used a little bit and leached out, and you got to reapply. So if you keep putting N, P, and K at equal concentrations all the time, what's happening is your phosphorus actually doesn't get used as much as your nitrogen, and it accumulates much better and it sticks around much, much better, to the point where you have enough of a savings bank of phosphorus in your soil that you don't really get anything out of putting more and more and more. So it's really good to understand, instead of just buying a mixture of all-purpose fertilizer, to kind of understand what you have and then start buying the nutrients that you actually need. And then what you'll find is you'll save some money, and it's much better for the environment, because when you have high phosphorus runoff, that's when we typically see those algae blooms, those big problems that can happen, that happened in Lake Erie. Wow, it's a while back. It's almost been 10 years, but not quite, where they had such a large algae bloom, alluding to a lot of phosphorus runoffs that caused that algae to bloom and create a toxin in the water. So phosphorus is one of those things that it's just good to do a soil test, know what you have, and apply what you need.
Right. And that's not something that you're going to need to keep reapplying, like the nitrogen. If it's in the soil, you're good. Because like Dan said, it's low mobility. It's going to stick around for a while. Like for pasture fields, when you're spreading manure repeatedly in the same field, we often see a lot of phosphorus buildup in that soil. And, phosphorus is great because it's going to help the fruits develop. You're going to get beautiful tomatoes, but it's not so great when it becomes so strong that it's going to start running off and causing environmental concerns. So you want to spread it out, make sure that you're rotating your livestock regularly, and then also make sure that you're not over applying it in your garden. No point in throwing extra money in the soil, right?
That's right. And there are forms. If you just need phosphorus, you can get things that are really, really high in phosphorus and not so high in anything else. Things like diammonium phosphate, monoammonium phosphate. So we call them MAP and DAP.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just need nitrogen, you can get chemical urea that's just nitrogen. It's 4600 because it doesn't have P and K. So if your P and K are high, urea is your best bet, and it's probably more concentrated nitrogen than your general fertilizers. So if you got to be a little bit, have some knowledge on the concentration of that nutrient in order not to burn things up, like we're talking about with the salts. So, all right, the next one is potassium, which I know it starts with a P, but it's actually...
This is the frustrating one when you get to that NPK.
Yeah, and Karen's notorious for doing this.
Oh my gosh, I switch them up all the time. It's just like, okay, hello dyslexia, how are you doing today? But the K is potassium.
Yeah, it's obviously potassium has a silent K.
Right?
No, it's just the periodic table, right? NP and K. That's what it goes by. But they designated potassium K.
But it's also your third number on the bag.
And honestly, potassium is something that I see a lot of deficiencies in the Ohio Valley area. Definitely phosphorus, but I would say the second most deficient nutrient is potassium. So it's funny. Like I'm looking at this fact sheet and it says, in general, soils don't need potassium. I don't know if they're kind of talking about Oregon.
Well, they're not saying it doesn't need it. They're saying it doesn't need as much of it as your phosphorus and your nitrogen.
Well, and you know what, the interesting thing about potassium is that you need different amounts in clay soils versus sandy soils. And
Yes.
it's just so I would argue that you actually, in terms of parts per million, if you look at our tri-state recommendations for corn and soybean production, they're recommending 20 to 40 parts per million of phosphorus. But in loam and clay soils, the potassium recommendation is 120 to 170 parts per million. And honestly, like if you look at the numbers in a soil test, you'll see phosphorus and potassium about the same. But according to the tri-state recommendations, they do recommend higher levels of potassium for good function. But you want to make sure that you have a well-balanced macronutrient amount. And sometimes you can't treat everything at the same time. Sometimes you have to do things in steps. And potassium, just like phosphorus, is one of those things that can build up as well. So the good news is that if you do build up your potassium, what you'll find is that it does stick around longer, but it is something that shouldn't be ignored. And I think with the nutrient management attention that we gave phosphorus because of the algae blooms and the problems environmentally with over applying phosphorus, potassium didn't get a whole lot of attention. So what I notice is that people don't seem to worry too much about potash as much as phosphorus, but they're both macronutrients and they're both important for functions. If you look at potassium here as far as like what it does for the plant, in this fact sheet, they say it helps the plant immune system and rooting ability. So one of the things that we harp on all the time is healthy roots and non-stressed plants. So if you have a potassium deficiency, chances are the plant's not going to root as well and you're going to have more problems. So just when you do the soil test, it'll give you both numbers. It'll give you some good recommendations, but it's just something that you do want to pay attention to. I would say as much as phosphorus, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I want to take this opportunity. You were talking about different soil types. To note that different soil tests use different techniques, and some soil tests are better for some certain soils, and some soil tests are better for other soils. So, for instance, here in Appalachia at WVU, we use the Malick 3 test. Whereas if you were to say send your soil to someplace over in Indiana, well, Indiana has very different soils. They're much more alkaline than ours. And so they use a different soil test. And the recommendations from each of those testing systems might be a little different. And so you do want to make sure that you are getting a soil test done using a methodology that is recommended for your general area's soil types. So if you typically have a more alkaline soil, Malick 3 may not be the best one for you. Whereas if you have an acidic soil, nice like clay soil that we have over here, that's the perfect soil test for you. So make sure that you are getting your soil test done close to where you are growing stuff so that they're more likely to utilize a soil testing technique that's recommended for that soil type.
Yeah, and in fact, Ohio has kind of been standardizing Malick 3 for both phosphorus and potassium extraction. So Malick 3 is kind of the one that when we talk about these recommendations, it's what I use. I would
Right.
say it's 9 out of 10 soil labs will use it, and I'm thinking it's much more than 90%.
On the eastern side of the country, yeah, but once you get out west, it changes.
Well, around here. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we're not I
I
mean,
know we don't get out west with the show, but there are people that listen to the podcast all around the world. So we want to make sure that they recognize to use a local soil test.
that's true. I should have specified. Yeah, you get used to it, and you're right, Karen. That's absolutely spot on. Do soil tests locally because they know the numbers. They see the numbers. They have better what do you call it, titrations, and they've actually done experiments where they've seen plant responses to nutrients, and they kind of know what's deficient and what's not.
Yeah. And universities typically have those reference systems where they have done those experiments based on different soil types and trying to make sure that they're giving you the best recommendations for the crop that you're growing in the area that you're growing it. And actually, we have a whole lot of great fact sheets on our extension.wvu.edu webpage. If you were to search WVU extension and soil fertility, you'll come up with a great page. And I like how they have it laid out because there's different levels. So you can grow your knowledge, which are basic introductions to soil testing and nutrient applications and liming application. And then you can go down a level to master the subject, where you have much more in-depth things, including crop fertility, recommendation tools for farms and things like that. Being able to determine what you're growing and how much that specific crop needs for its health. Everything's different. You're going to have different needs for an orchard than you are for a hayfield. That's pretty obvious. But even tomatoes and cucumbers need different nutrients. And so it's really important to get a grip on that, especially if you're trying to grow at a higher volume for production and for sale. So if you are a small farm or you're trying to become a small farm, these are some great resources, again, on the WVU Extension webpage. And I know Ohio State has an amazing library of resources as well. Do look into your state's extension service and find out what resources they have available online. And as always, you can contact your local extension office on the phone, and you can reach me at 304-234-3673. Once again, that's 304-234-3673. Dan's number is 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.